Thanks very much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to share some of the findings of a research project I've been working on for the last few years. Just to acknowledge at this stage, I've obviously got a huge cast of thousands on the author list here. It is a massive project, as I'll go on to talk about, with lots of different dimensions. But specifically today, I'm going to be focusing on looking at how junior sports clubs in Australia actually respond to sort of different inclusion policy imperatives. Although inclusion by its very nature means all sorts of different groups, I'm specifically going to focus in this presentation on the inclusion of young people with disabilities and looking at how clubs respond to policy agendas that suggest they should be supporting and encouraging young people with disabilities to get involved and engaged. So just as a bit of sort of background context before we kind of get into the theory and methods, there's been a steady focus in Australia and internationally over the last 3 decades on the belief that sport should be inclusive. It should be available for everyone. Everyone should have the right to participate and to be engaged and to have those opportunities. As we've mentioned, sport can bring particular benefits, and there's a belief that those should be open and available for all groups of society. At a sort of broader and outside of sport level, the National Disability Insurance Scheme within Australia makes a specific mention of the right for people with disabilities to access sport, recreation and leisure opportunities. So there's a much sort of broader, wider context here as well, not just within sport itself. Disability sport has had quite a checkered and ad hoc organisational structure, both within Australia and internationally, and there tends to be lots of different groups that lobby for people with different types of disabilities and provide opportunities for them. So this led to quite a sort of disarray of opportunities and provision. But since the 1990s, the Sports Commission here, helped by the Australian Paralympic Committee, have really sort of pushed towards this idea of a mainstreaming agenda, whereby disability provision is brought under the responsibilities of mainstream sport and organisational structures. So there's been increasing pressure on national sports associations and state sporting associations to ensure that their sport reaches out and connects with people with disabilities. So with that sort of mainstreaming agenda brings certain tensions and issues, and this has been written about quite a lot, well not a lot actually, sort of a number of studies have looked at it at that sort of structural and organisational level, particularly within the UK and Canada, looked at some of the issues that come about from trying to merge those different types of organisations into the banner of kind of mainstream sport. And we've seen sort of similar tensions might arise when we look at the merging of female and male sports organisations and the problems this can create for the less powerful organisations being subsumed into this overarching sports organisational board. So there's been tensions revealed at that organisational level, but very few studies have actually looked at, well, what does this look like on the ground level? What does this look like for sports clubs who are the ones that actually have to translate this mainstreaming agenda into practice? So how are mainstream junior sports clubs actually coping or dealing with these imperatives that suggest they should be providing for people with disabilities? What research there is available at the moment sort of shows that often sports clubs don't offer at all for people with disabilities. And the data that's coming from the participants themselves and people with disabilities in their engagement with sport shows that they'll often have poor or negative experiences. They'll struggle to get engaged, to get involved, and they'll face particular challenges around stigma and restricted access once they are part of community sport. So we sort of know bits about the picture, but there's not really been many sort of studies that have looked at, well, how do clubs themselves actually engage and respond, and how do clubs deal with what is actually quite a challenging policy imperative. So that's what I want to focus on today. I'm going to have a look with you at how clubs actually engage with these policy imperatives, what's the sort of mechanisms they go through to actually think this is a good idea and it's something that my club should be doing, and then actually look at how do they translate that into practice. So what approaches do junior sports clubs use to involve people with disabilities in their day-to-day activity? Theoretically, I don't want to sort of spend too much time on this, but it's useful to see where some of our conclusions are coming from, how theories kind of inform that. So in terms of looking how clubs engage with particular policy imperatives, we've drawn on the work of Stephen Ball, who's an educational sociologist who does a lot of policy analysis work in schools. And we found Ball was particularly useful for looking at this idea of policy implementation and the fact that it's quite a complex process. It's not, as we've already sort of talked about this morning, it's not just about a top-down process of sports organisations putting a policy imperative down and the clubs taking that up. It's also not just about the clubs deciding at the grassroots level what they're going to do. There's kind of an interplay between the two and lots of other things that go on in between. And Ball's work's really helpful for sort of highlighting that type of complexity that goes on. As mentioned, he's an educational academic, and he looked at how schools respond to certain policy imperatives and basically tried to understand, well, why do some schools do things in particular ways? Why do some schools get involved with particular policy agendas and others don't? And what are the factors that influence that process? So he suggests that the idea of implementation is too kind of static, and he suggested that enactment is probably a better term to understand how different organisations engage with policy. And enactment involves both an interpretation by the people on the ground, so in this case the club volunteers interpreting what they think is meant by policy imperatives, and a whole range of factors will influence that process. So things like how important a policy imperative is thought to be within a club context, what work they're already doing, what they're engaging in, how much pressure is put on them from above or from their members or from their local community will influence that process of interpretation. From interpretation, they then move into the translation phase, which is the actual making things into practice. And again, lots of things will influence the translation process, what resources are available within a club, what funding they have, how the members feel about it. So it's, I feel, a useful sort of theoretical concept for showing how dynamic policy implementation is. What particularly we focus on here is Ball's notion of policy actors. And policy actors are anyone really that can have an influence in that enactment of policy. So it could be the club volunteers, it could be the coaches, it could be the club members, could be the state sporting association, local councils. All these individuals will have an impact on what happens in that club. And Ball, again looking in a school context, developed a typology of different sorts of policy actors. Particularly we're going to focus here on the policy entrepreneur. And Ball describes this person as an actor who originates or champions and represents particular policies. They're usually charismatic people and persuasive personalities and forceful agents of change. They're personally invested in and identified with policy ideas and their enactment. And Ball argues that policy entrepreneurs bring along also what he calls policy enthusiasts, so he inspires other people within that organisational setting to get on board with particular policy imperatives. Alongside this, Ball also talks about the idea of context, and as I've mentioned, how particular contexts around a club might shape their engagement and involvement within particular policy imperatives. So we've very much used Ball's work to look at how and why clubs engage with inclusion and what actually is needed within a club to make that process happen. And then in looking at the approaches that clubs use to provision and offering opportunities for young people with disabilities, we've drawn on the work of DeLuca looking at educational inclusivity. So again, educational-based theory which looked at inclusion and inclusive teaching within schools, but we feel is quite very relevant to a sports club setting. So DeLuca suggests that inclusion can happen on a spectrum. That in itself is nothing new. We often talk about the inclusion spectrum. But he suggests that some of the things and the practices, particularly within a teaching setting, that are presented as being inclusive, actually sit more towards this idea of normative inclusion. So he describes normative inclusion as being more of a kind of active assimilation. Suggests as an idea of a dominant norm, and normative inclusion is about bringing people up to that dominant norm. So trying to make people the same as us, the same as the dominant group. So with a normative understanding of inclusion, not much changes really. We allow people that are different into our setting, but we don't really change the setting much to accommodate them. They're allowed in, but that's sort of as far as it goes really. He suggests then that we kind of move along this spectrum to an integrative aspect of inclusion, and this results in accommodation and modification to allow diverse groups to participate, but there still remains that dominant group and the standards that group aspire to, and they're sort of still in that position of power. So within integrative, again, there's modification to allow diverse groups to participate, but no real power shifting there, no really changing the mechanisms that mean that people are excluded in the first place. So you can look at this in things like small-sided games and the game sense approach to sport, where we modify sport to make it more accessible for different types of groups to participate, but we don't fundamentally change the competitive and sort of hierarchical nature of sport within that. Then De Luca suggests we can move more towards these more transformational forms of inclusion, where power sharing and power shifting begins to occur. And that happens with the dialogical and the transgressive or transformative types of inclusion. And within both of these, the dialogical, we still have a dominant group, but they begin to welcome and celebrate difference. So it's much more part of that setting and thought to be a good thing. Whereas in the transgressive approach, it's the idea that power relations are completely diffused and everyone is welcomed as equal and everyone has the opportunity to participate in ways that they want to, that plays to their strengths and allows them to engage fully. So there's no kind of dominant standard there. So we've used this, as I mentioned, to really look at the approaches that clubs offer and begin to kind of critique this. So in terms of the methodologies, I mentioned it's quite a large project. It's part of an Australian Research Council funded linkage project looking at managing diversity more broadly in junior sport. We're in partnership with Vic Health and the Australian Football League as part of this project, and the Centre for Multicultural Youth in Melbourne as well. And we've been undertaking this research for 4 years now, involving 31 clubs in total across 7 sports. I'm focusing today specifically on data from 4 clubs, and they were, as it says there, probably the most heavily engaged in offering opportunities for young people with disabilities. They'd established sort of sections, had a number of participants with disabilities, and also they were continually advocated to us whenever we were seeking participants and clubs to be involved of, oh, have you spoken to such and such club? They've got a great programme for people with disabilities. So really sort of put forward as best practice examples. In the overall project, we undertook a multi-method approach, but I've focused today specifically on interviews with committee members and coaches. I've not included today the interviews we did with young people or the parents, just for sort of time purposes. And these interviews were coded using a thematic analysis which drew back to our theoretical frame. So in terms of the findings and looking at how did these policy imperatives become translated, how did the clubs get on board and get engaged with being involved with young people with disabilities, time and time again it came back to this idea of the individual and the individual champion. And Alison's already mentioned that earlier about this idea of you need a champion within your club to get particular things done. And we found what we call them as policy entrepreneurs. There were a number of people within these clubs that had a real personal interest in inclusion and people with disabilities, underpinned by a strong sort of social justice agenda, the belief that we should be reaching out to different communities. It was very important for these people to be involved and to engage within our club. They'd often initiated some sort of come and try activity before kind of they became really aware of policy agendas. But once these different policy agendas came down from their state sporting associations or even from their local councils, they really kind of jumped on board and sort of saw the potential of this and used those policy agendas to grow participation at the club. So they got funding from various sources to get resources, equipment. And through this, they sort of championed support within their wider club. They brought on board coaches, other volunteers, parents to engage as well. And one of the key skills they showed was they had really kind of good networks. They had good networks with local schools, good networks within the community, good networks with their state sporting association and the council, and they really used those to kind of build the provision and develop the provision and get the word of mouth out that they were offering opportunities. As the first quote here indicates from a volunteer, this volunteer got involved and was a real champion for this area because of previous history with their parents. There were a number that got involved because their child had a disability and they thought that they wanted to enhance and improve provision. And then the second quote from, again, another policy entrepreneur, just this idea of how they connected and linked organisations to make sure they got the provision off the ground and up and running. In terms of approaches to inclusion, there were different approaches used. So Club 1 offered opportunities for a range of disabilities, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, and a spectrum of intellectual disabilities as well. But this entrepreneur had to basically keep that provision completely separate from the main workings of the club. So his group came and participated and played and trained at totally different times to the rest of the club. They had no interaction with the club whatsoever. And I think the quote there from him about his committee, he got support from his committee and they said it was okay, but only as long as it didn't interfere with anything else. So this section here was completely separate from the rest of the club. At Club 2, they mainly focused on young people with intellectual disabilities, and they had a separate section again that trained on a different night to the rest of the club. And they had some contact at social events with the rest of the club, but generally they sort of kept to themselves. They competed in a local all abilities league, so again was kind of in a structure and system outside of the workings of the club. Club 3, again, mostly intellectual disabilities and competed in an all abilities league. And they'd been more proactive in trying to support joint social activities and actually have training at the same time, so that the main players at the club and the young people with disabilities were actually there and physically at the club at the same time. And then Club 4, again, catered for a range of disabilities, had some separate teams, some young people integrated into mainstream teams. All training took place on the same night, and they had every social event was joint. There was nothing that was sort of specifically social for the young people with disabilities. It was all together and clear that everyone was welcome. They also had an inclusion officer on the committee. They competed in various leagues as appropriate to what the young people wanted to do. So you can see sort of varying forms there of provision, but a theme running through all of this was the idea of separating the disability provision. There was also a number of tensions in policy and provision that kind of arose from these. The volunteers that we spoke to sort of commented on how policy was helpful, but also talked about how they felt policy was forcing them to develop provision that was structured in a particular way. And this was really focused on doing competitive training, forming into competitive leagues and competitions. And so it encouraged the club to focus on young people with particular types of disabilities. Generally, these were perceived to be disabilities that were easier to manage. So young people with mild to moderate intellectual disabilities who could more readily fit into the mainstream structures. So it didn't necessarily encourage that spectrum of inclusion that we were talking about. So you can see here the quotes from the various volunteers that one had an issue with the State Sporting Association officers sort of trying to always promote them to have young people that could fit into this structured tournament, and sort of saying, you know, we don't have young people like that. We need different types of structures and systems to support us if we're going to be inclusive to all young people with disabilities. And then one of the clubs just sort of completely took his group, Club 1, away from this idea of competing and being part of a competitive structure, and just said to the State Sporting Association in that case, I just don't have those types of players, and what I want to do is make sure that players have a go, and that's the most important. So just pulling the presentation to a close, I guess in terms of the enactment of policy and how it actually happens, those individuals, those entrepreneurs are absolutely key. They're central for even mobilising these inclusion agendas, and they're the people that gather support and pull people together, navigate all the different types of resources available, and make sure that provision can be offered. So they're absolutely key people within their clubs and doing absolutely fantastic work. But in terms of the actual provision that offers, I think going back to our DeLuca spectrum, what we found was this tends to fit on this normative, integrative scale of inclusion. It's great that opportunities are happening, but within mainstream settings, they're only really happening for a certain type of young person with disabilities. And that tends to be a person that can fit most readily into mainstream structures. So there's still a whole group of young people that actually can't access and don't feel able or have the opportunity to participate because of the mainstreaming agendas that exist. And this performance versus participation discourse is very telling. Even though it's about a participation discourse, inclusion, performance still runs through the policies that these clubs were being encouraged to engage with. It was all about training, structured competition, and going into that pathway. So in terms of the conclusions, I think the key thing we're taking away from this data is the need to sort of go back to the beginning, really, when we're looking at inclusion and inclusion policy imperatives, need to think about, well, what actually does inclusion mean? And clubs have different interpretations of this, sporting organisations and associations have very different interpretations of this. But if we want to be genuinely inclusive, if we want to move towards that dialogical and transgressive approach, we really need a kind of rethink of how we're positioning inclusion within policy and practice. Those individuals are central to making it happen, but above that we need to think about, well, actually what do we want them to do, and how do we rethink inclusion to be more open and accessible to everyone, and not just those that can fit into our existing systems. Thank you.
Just one quick one. Sorry, do you see any alignment here between the story you've just told and how we may handle obesity? So that cohort of people who are overweight or obese, do you think that could be a similar story in terms of clubs trying to engage with that collective?
Oh, absolutely. And I think if you sort of go down that path of encouraging clubs that that's something they should be doing, they target those that are most readily accessible and easy to engage with. So those that don't fit within that become even further stigmatised. I think the engagement of clubs in obesity is quite dangerous territory potentially for further stigmatising people that are already shamed by society.